The Block Watch. A new camera sits on Mark's porch. The red light blinks. In every window on the street, the curtains twitch in perfect synchronization. The watchers have been waiting. 30 years earlier, in 1994, the Block Watch began as a whisper. Now it was muscle, teeth, and the kind of surveillance that didn't need courts or warrants. Now it was his neighbors, his landlord, his only friend. Now it was him, standing alone in the wreckage of a life that had never been his own. But the excavation had started in dust and shadow 3 weeks before. The bleachers groaned under their own weight as Mark dragged the rusted crowbar across the concrete floor. His thick rubber gloves, yellowed at the fingertips, squeaked with each pull. Dust hung in the shafts of afternoon light that cut through the high gymnasium windows, turning the air into something almost solid. The metal made a sound like teeth grinding as it scraped across grit and the residue of 30 years. His boots crunched. The asthma wheezed in his chest, that familiar rattle, the sound of his lungs apologizing for existing. He paused, hunched forward, letting the crowbar rest against his hip. The skeleton of the bleachers stretched above him like the rib cage of something long dead, shadows pooling in the gaps between the metal stands. He crouched, knees popped, a dry, sharp crack, the sound of a body that had been built for work and nothing else. His fingers reached into the narrow gap between the concrete pillar and a sagging floor joist, rubber gloves making soft sounds as they rubbed against the damp stone. Something cold. Plastic. His breath caught. The yellow beam of his LED flashlight cut through the darkness of the gap. There. A bundle. Mark pulled. It came free in one motion. Black plastic, brittle with age, wrapped around something hard and shaped like a camera. He peeled back the fabric. It was a t-shirt. Detroit Tigers. 1984 championship blue, faded to nearly gray. Underneath, a Panasonic Omnimovie PV200 camcorder, caked in fine gray silt, but structurally intact. The lens reflected his startled face back at him, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. His thumb moved to the tape door. A handwritten sticker yellowed. The adhesive was peeling at the corner. Block Watch, 09/22/94. The letters were fading but deliberate. Someone had labeled this. Someone had hidden this. 11 hours later, Mark sat at his card table in the dark of his apartment on Selden St. streetlights, flickered outside, casting orange and black stripes across his walls. The camcorder was connected to a small, boxy 19-inch CRT television via a tangle of black wires that looked like they'd been stripped from the guts of a dozen dead machines. The universal power adapter hummed, a high-pitched electronic whine that made his teeth ache. The screen was still nothing but blue static. The tape heads whirred inside the camera. He waited, one hand wrapped around a glass of lukewarm water that had been sitting here for hours. The static cleared. Grainy footage appeared. Night vision style, the colors washed out and green. A mailbox. A man's hand. Younger Mr. Henderson from across the street, the one who'd moved away in 1996 and only recently returned to the neighborhood. He was placing something inside the mailbox. A baggie. White powder. He looked directly at the camera. A nod. The date stamp burned at the bottom of the screen. Say P22/1994. The camera panned. Another figure stood in the shadows, just outside the frame, holding a notepad. And then, a thumbs up. Mark's jaw went rigid. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. He knew that silhouette. The bulk of the shoulders, the way he stood with his weight on his back foot. Elias, his landlord. The man who'd lived 3 doors down for nearly 2 decades. The one who organized the neighborhood meetings and collected the Block Watch fees. But something else was in the shot. The background. A house with a number on the door. 3:42. His house, his childhood home. There was a broken window. The same broken window. The same one that had led to his father's arrest 30 years ago. The one that had started everything. Mark's hand moved toward the screen, as if he could reach through the glass and pull the moment back, undo it. The tape continued playing. Henderson was disappearing into the night. The pad was still visible in Elias's hands. Elias was writing something down. Mark pressed stop. The screen froze on Elias's face, half turned, the notepad clearly visible in his hands. He sat back in his chair and didn't move for a very long time. 7 in the morning. Gray, drizzling rain. The alley behind the high school was empty, except for him and the wet shadows. Mark walked quickly, the camcorder hidden deep in his bulky canvas jacket, pressed against his ribs. He'd considered leaving it at home. He'd considered burning it. He'd considered, for about 90 seconds around 3 a.m., throwing himself into the Detroit River and being done with all of it. Instead, he was taking it to work. The dumpster appeared in his path like it had been placed by divine malice. A heavy, green metal thing, its lid open, its contents a smell like decay and old pizza. Mark stopped. His hand was already moving to step around it when the dumpster was kicked. It fell into his path with a shriek of metal on stone. A tall man stepped out of the rain. Scarred face, heavy shoulders, the kind of scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his jaw. A souvenir from something sharp and angry. Jax. Mark knew this man. Everyone on the block knew this man. He appeared at the neighborhood meetings, sat in the back, never spoke, just watched. The exit behind him was blocked. Jax moved. Not rushed. Something worse. Methodical. Like he'd done this before. His fist opened into a grab, and suddenly Mark's collar was in his hands, and Mark's back was against the brick wall hard enough to knock the air out of his lungs. His head snapped back and hit the masonry with a dull thud. Stars erupted at the edges of his vision. "You found something," Jack said. His voice was low and rough, like he'd swallowed glass. Mark's eyes were wide. His teeth were gritted so hard his jaw ached. He couldn't breathe. Mark drove his knee upward. It connected with Jax's midsection, not perfect, but hard enough. Jax grunted, and his grip loosened fractionally. That was enough. Mark's hand closed around his lunch thermos. Stainless steel, heavy with coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He swung it in a tight arc at the side of Jax's head. The impact was bright and loud. Clang! The sound of metal hitting bone, and the moment stretched. And then Jax was staggering, his hands going to the side of his skull, and Mark was moving, pushing past him, running. His heavy boots splashed through a puddle. The rain was cold against his face. He didn't look back as he rounded the corner, his heart hammering like a trapped bird trying to escape its own ribs. The basement records room of the library was sterile and fluorescent, the kind of place where time had been deliberately murdered. Sarah leaned over a light box, her face illuminated from below. She was holding a magnifying loupe to a strip of 16mm film, her eyes narrow with concentration. Behind her, Mark held the camcorder screen toward her. Sarah was the only person Mark had ever told. About his father. About the arrest in 1994. About the way the neighborhood had treated him after. The looks, the way people crossed the street, the way teachers had called on him in class like they were doing him a favor by acknowledging his existence. Sarah had listened. Sarah had said his father's conviction was wrong. Sarah had been the first person to ever suggest that the neighborhood's narrative might not be the truth. But now, as he pressed play on the camcorder, her face went pale. Her lip was between her teeth, and her eyes were darting. This was different from curiosity. This was fear. The screen showed a modern-looking house, a for sale sign in the yard. A woman, Mrs. Gable, who owned the bakery on the corner, was keying into the side door. She looked around, checking. Then she pulled out a phone, a burner. She left it on the counter and disappeared. The timestamp burned at the bottom of the screen. 2 days ago. That's from the tape? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Mark nodded. There are more? He nodded again. Sarah straightened. She removed the magnifying loupe. She didn't look at him. You need to get out of here, she said quietly. Grand River Avenue, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The sky was overcast and the wind was picking up, pushing Mark's rusted 2005 Ford Taurus like it was a toy. He'd decided, somewhere between the library and the parking lot, that he was going to the police station. He was going to give them the camcorder. He was going to tell them everything he'd seen. He was going to stop existing in the margins of a lie. The black Cadillac Escalade appeared 3 cars back. It had tinted windows. It had a front bumper that looked like it had been designed by someone who wanted to announce its intentions. It closed the distance between them with the steadiness of something that had all the time in the world. Mark pulled a hard left. The Taurus screamed, tires smoking, the whole vehicle protesting. In the rearview mirror, the Escalade didn't even brake. It just kept coming, its front bumper inches from his trunk, the tinted windows revealing nothing. They were on a stretch of street with nowhere to hide. Warehouses on one side, shuttered storefronts on the other. No side streets, no alleys, just forward. Mark pressed the accelerator and felt the car's engine give everything it had, which was maybe 60 miles per hour on a good day. The Escalade rammed him. The collision was sudden and total. Mark's head jerked sideways. The driver's side window exploded inward, 1,000 diamond shards of safety glass cascading into the cabin like hail. His knuckles were bleeding where they'd hit the frame. There was glass in his hair, his shirt, the crevices between his fingers. He had maybe 5 seconds before the next hit. Mark pulled the emergency brake and spun the wheel hard to the right. The Taurus went into a slide, the rear end fishtailing. There was an alley, narrow, debris-choked, the kind of space that looked like it had been designed to trap vehicles. He aimed for it and felt the car respond, just barely squeezing through the entrance. Behind him, the Escalade couldn't follow. It hit the brick entrance to the alley at full speed. The impact sent a shower of sparks across the pavement, orange tracers that looked like fireworks. Glass shattered, metal crumpled. But the alley had swallowed him, and the wide avenue was behind him now, and he was breathing through his teeth like an animal. The basement under the grocery store was lit by amber light from bulbs that hadn't been replaced in decades. It was warm in the way that only underground spaces could be, the kind of warmth that suggested the earth was breathing underneath everything. And everywhere, there were files, wall-to-wall dossiers, VHS tapes stacked in towers. A central table held a neighborhood map covered in colored pins, red, blue, green, yellow. Mark stared at his own street and found the red pins immediately. 4 of them. His house had 3 red pins and 1 blue one, and the blue one was labeled with handwriting in black ink. Phase 3, isolate. His hands were shaking. He opened a dossier at random. It was thick. Inside were photographs of a man he recognized, Terrence Williams, who'd lived 2 streets over. Photographs of him entering the school at night. Photographs of him at what looked like a pawn shop. Photographs of him with people Mark didn't recognize, exchanges happening in dark parking lots. At the back of the file, a newspaper clipping. Local man charged in drug trafficking ring. The photo was Terrence, and he was in handcuffs, and his face was destroyed. Mark opened another file, and another. Dossiers on people who'd lived on the block, worked on the block, been fixtures of the neighborhood fabric. Each one had the same structure. Photographs documenting criminal activity, newspaper clippings of arrests, typed reports in what looked like 1990s-era font. Then he found his own. It was in a metal cabinet near the back of the room, a green hanging folder with his name typed on the label in that same 1990s font. Mark pulled it out. His hands were shaking so badly that the papers inside slipped and scattered across the table. A photograph of him as a child, maybe 10 years old, standing in front of his house on a summer morning. He was wearing a shirt with a hole in the collar, and he was looking at the camera like he was trying not to smile. Below it, a typed report. Subject mark: maintenance career path secured. Psychological profile: docile. Intervention unnecessary. And then dates: March 1994, April 1994, September 22nd, 1994. Notes in margins. Someone had been tracking him. Someone had decided what his future would be. Someone had orchestrated the event, the break-in, the arrest, the conviction of his father, all because Mark's profile had been marked as intervention unnecessary. He was docile. He was suitable. He would work. He would not resist. The walls of the basement suddenly felt very close. His door was open when he got home. It shouldn't have been. He'd locked it. He always locked it. The key was in his pocket, still there, weight and presence of a thing left behind. But the door was open, and the light inside was wrong. The furniture rearranged or removed, and when Mark stepped inside, his television was a graveyard of broken glass. Wires dangled like entrails. The floor was a landscape of his own shredded clothes. Elias sat in Mark's armchair. He was calmly peeling an apple with a pocket knife, the blade silver and deliberate. Each peel curled into the air and fell into his lap. Jack stood behind the armchair, holding an iron pipe like it was an extension of his arm. "Hello, Mark," Elias said. He didn't look up from the apple. Mark froze in the doorway. His hands rose slightly, like he could push away what was about to happen through the sheer force of proximity. "The camcorder," Elias said. "Where is it?" Mark's mouth went dry. "You know," Elias continued, still peeling, "we've been very patient with you. Your father, that was 1994. That was necessary. He was resistant. He didn't understand that the block watch was about protection, about safety, about controlling the narrative." He took a bite of apple. "But you were supposed to be the easy one." The school boiler room was steaming and hot, the kind of place where the air itself felt thick. Pipes ran across the ceiling like the arteries of a machine that had been running non-stop for 50 years. The boiler itself was a massive black iron thing, its surface hot enough to blister skin on contact. Coal was piled in one corner, and a workbench was lined with tools, wrenches and hammers and things designed to move or break or build. Jax swung the iron pipe. Mark had been watching, waiting. He dove low. The pipe connected with a steam pipe above his head, and the steam erupted like a scream, white, hot, filling the space with vapor so thick that breathing became an act of faith. Mark tackled Jax into a pile of coal and soot. They went down hard, black dust exploding around them in a cloud. Jax recovered. He was faster than Mark had expected and stronger. His hands found Mark's shoulders and slammed him against the boiler. The heat was immediate and total. Mark's skin sizzled through his shirt. He could smell burning fabric and something underneath it that was worse, the cooking of his own flesh. He fumbled for the workbench behind him, fingers searching blindly. There. Cold steel. A large crescent wrench, heavy enough to matter. He closed his hand around it just as Jax's hands closed around his throat. The world began to close. His vision tunneled. Black spots appeared, spreading like ink in water. Jax was screaming something, but Mark couldn't hear it. Couldn't hear anything except the roaring of blood in his own ears and the wheeze of his lungs trying to pull air through a throat that no longer existed. Mark lifted the wrench. He drove it downward at an angle, aiming for the inside of Jax's knee. The bone cracked, a sharp, sickening pop that echoed through the boiler room. Jax's hands released. He screamed, a high animal sound. Mark struck again, this time at his jaw, felt teeth give way, and Jax was collapsing, reeling backward into the darkness of the pit behind him. He fell with a sound like a sack of concrete hitting stone. Mark stood, gasping. His throat was on fire. His shoulder felt like it had been flayed. The wrench fell from his hand and clattered on the floor. The school library at 3 a.m. was a cathedral of shadows. Moonlight came through the tall windows in silver bars, cutting the darkness into neat sections. Mark limped between the stacks, his shoulder bleeding through his shirt, pain radiating down his left arm. His breathing was ragged. His eyes were swimming. Sarah was there. She stood between two bookshelves, and when she saw him, relief flooded her face. She looked like someone who'd been afraid for his life, like someone who cared. But she was holding the camcorder. Mark's hand reached for her. He wanted to tell her that he'd done it. He'd escaped. They could go to the police together. They could. But then she turned the screen toward herself, not to him. She pressed play, and on that screen was a girl. 17, maybe 18 years old. Younger Sarah. It was 1994. She was standing in shadows, and in her hands was a notepad. And next to her, directing her, gesturing with his hands, pointing to where she needed to look, was Elias. The younger version of Sarah was whispering something to him. Elias was nodding. Then he was looking at the camera, looking directly at the camera, and he was putting his thumb up. Mark understood. Sarah had been there. Sarah had been part of it from the beginning. Sarah had whispered the lies about his father. Sarah had been the one with the notepad. Sarah had orchestrated the entire construction of his childhood, his career, his isolation. The present-day Sarah lowered the camcorder. She looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. "You think you've won?" she said quietly. The roof of the school was exposed and windswept. Mark stood at the edge, and below him the city sprawled, dark and lit by streetlights, a network of blocks that all looked the same. 3 figures emerged from the stairwell behind him. Sarah, Elias. A woman Mark recognized as another of the neighbors. He'd seen her at the meetings, nodding along with the discussion about block security. "You can't run anymore," Sarah said. Mark looked at them. Then he reached into his pocket. The remote was small and silver, a thing he'd designed himself and rigged into the school's ancient emergency system over the course of 3 afternoons. His finger moved toward the button. "What is that?" Elias's voice was steady, but Mark could hear the uncertainty underneath it. 30 years, Mark said quietly. "You've been watching, recording, deciding. Every person on that block has been an actor in a play you wrote." He looked at Sarah. "Except the play isn't real. It's just you. All of it is just you." He pressed the button. The fire suppression fans roared to life, massive industrial machinery that had been dormant in the ductwork since the 1980s. The entire roof became a blinding dust storm, visibility collapsing to nothing. Mark could see their faces for one more moment, surprise and then panic. And then they were gone into the chaos. Mark turned and ran toward the service elevator shaft that he'd rigged open 3 hours earlier. He didn't have a rope or a plan. He just had momentum and the knowledge that the shaft descended all the way to the basement. He jumped. The fall was exactly as long as it felt like it would be. His hands scraped against old metal. His body hit the cage on the way down and bounced off. For a moment, the world was pain and spinning. Then his shoulder hit something solid, a maintenance ledge, and he stopped, gasping, bleeding, alive. The Detroit PD 3rd Precinct was bright with morning sun. The desk sergeant looked like he'd been processing paperwork for so long that he'd forgotten what surprised looked like. But when Mark slid the camcorder and the stack of manila folders across the high wooden desk, something changed in his expression. "What is this?" the sergeant asked. "Evidence," Mark said. His hands were bandaged in greasy rags. His voice was gone, something sandpapered to destruction. 30 years of it. The sergeant opened one of the folders. His face went very still. He looked up at Mark, then back at the folder, then picked up his radio. Within 45 minutes, patrol cars had left the precinct heading west. Mark watched from the window as they rolled down Grand River Avenue toward the neighborhood. He'd given them everything: the camcorder, the dossiers, the list of names. All of it. He thought about his father, who'd spent 3 years in prison for a crime he hadn't committed. He thought about Terrence Williams and all the others. He thought about the years of his own life that had been architected by people sitting in a basement, deciding who would be useful and who would be eliminated. Then he thought about nothing. The neighborhood was empty at noon. Crime scene tape fluttered from the Hendersons' porch. Yellow and black, institutional and final. Mark walked down his street slowly, taking in the details. The houses looked smaller than he remembered. The trees were older. Time had actually passed. Days and weeks and years had accumulated, and the facade of safety had been maintained through it all. He reached his own porch and stopped. A camera sat on his welcome mat. Not a camcorder. A digital 4K camera, brand new, the kind of thing that could stream live video to a server somewhere. The red record light was blinking. One on, one off, one on. Mark stared at it. Then he looked up. Every window on the street, every single one. The curtains twitched in perfect synchronization. Not a coincidence, not random. A choreographed thing, the curtains moving at the exact same moment, as if pulled by a single hand. In the window directly across from his house, a face appeared. A child, maybe 8 years old. Mark didn't recognize them. The child raised one finger to his lips. Shh. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of a neighborhood watch sign, one of those metal plaques that hung on poles, was hitting against the wood in the wind. Each impact was deliberate and loud. The red light on the camera continued blinking. Mark's shadow loomed long over the house, stretching down the steps and across the sidewalk. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He stood there and watched the light blink, on, off, and understood that the excavation had been the beginning, not the end. The truth he'd uncovered had changed nothing. The system was too deep, too distributed, too built into the infrastructure of something that called itself community. The camera recorded. The curtains didn't move again. Mark turned and walked away from his house, away from the street, away from the place where he'd been born. The camera behind him recorded every step. Somewhere, in a server or hard drive, or a basement under a grocery store, someone was watching. The block watch never stopped watching. End.